Now, to the main event. We always end MadFest on a high, and today will be no different. I'd like to introduce my former colleague, Rory Sutherland, who will be actually running a live master class today. It's going to be about 40 to 50 minutes long, and some of his cohort of students are actually in the audience as well. So without further ado, how do you introduce a legend? Very difficult, but I'm going to give it my best. Welcome Rory Sutherland to the stage, everybody.
So in strict adherence to the laws of economics, I will make much more eye contact to the front rows than I usually would. So thank you, everybody in the front rows. And thank you also for, I think, in teaching Mad Masters, helping me prove to myself something I'd always suspected, which is that ultimately teaching creativity is more valuable than practicing it. And actually, one of the things I think we've done, which always makes me feel a bit guilty, is in order to sell creative ideas, you've got to create this kind of weird mystique, as if they're unbelievably rare and precious, and they only happen once every 5 years. You've got to create a kind of idea of scarcity around creativity, because in fairness, it's difficult selling a creative idea, because the problem with an idea is that once you've shared it, you've also given it away. So it is difficult to make money effectively selling ideas. But I think an unfortunate consequence of that is we kind of create this weird mystique of scarcity around creativity, when in reality there's an opportunity to be creative every time you make a decision. Every time you make a decision, what I recommend as a very simple hack is come up with a sensible, logical idea that won't get you fired and which gets everybody nodding along and saying that makes sense. Come up with that idea and then reserve a day or so for going, yes, but can we do better than that? That's probably the best approach. There's a famous agency which always did that. They did what they very rudely called a David Ogilvy ad, by which they meant a how, what, why, where, when explanatory ad, and they used to put it up on the wall and say, that's pretty good, that'll work, okay? Now we've got to do better than that. I think that's just a very, very good approach. So I'll tell a story about this, about the difficulty of effectively selling an idea, which had unfortunate consequences. So sometime in I think it was actually the 16th century, a bunch of French Huguenots, family called Chamberlain, or they were ultimately called Chamberlain-Ien when they moved to the UK, they fled France, fleeing religious persecution and also in search of a hot breakfast. And they arrived in Britain sometime in the 16th century and established themselves as accoucheurs, which is basically a posh name for male midwife. And over time, they acquired a very, very good reputation for being very, very good at delivering difficult births. And they could charge a fairly hefty premium for this. And what would happen if you asked for the Chamberlain family to be your accoucheur at the birth of your child, is they'd arrive in a carriage with an unbelievably heavy box, which had to be carried into the birthing chamber. Your wife was basically covered in a blanket so that she couldn't see anything that was happening, as it were, below the waist. And they would open this box, having removed everybody else in the room, and they would make strange noises with various bells and hammers and other devices, simply to create complete mystery around what was going on. As it happened, the hammers and the bells were completely irrelevant, okay? In fact, the contents of the box were completely irrelevant, and the weight of the box was quite likely artificial. It was just artificially weighted down with stuff to make it seem more substantial. The real idea they carried in an inside pocket in their coats, which was they'd invented the medical forceps. And for about 2 generations of this family, maybe even 3, a period of 100 or so years, the medical forceps, which you can see, one was discovered at one of their houses in the 20th century, was a family trade secret. And a few people calculated that if they'd actually shared this idea rather than keeping it secret, it probably would have saved hundreds of thousands of lives. But the way to make money out of it was A, to keep it secret, and B, to kind of distract people from where the source of your expertise really lay by creating all kinds of, almost literally, bells and whistles. And to be absolutely honest, if I'm being completely candid, I think the ad industry does a little bit of that. I think we create bells and whistles around ideas and try and make it seem unbelievably kind of complicated, simply because you can't just say, I had this idea right, and charge adequately for it, any proportion of what it's really worth. And in particular, of course, if you're paid by the hour, you have to some extent, pretend that there's a process which might be more complicated or more linear than really exists. And all ad agencies have done this, and it took me quite a while before I kind of learned to dislike it. I mean, it took me 20 years. What you tend to do as an ad agency is you take your most fashionable campaign, you then reverse engineer it or post-rationalize how it came about, and you claim that by following this process, you've effectively discovered the mother lode, and that all brand problems and all business problems from henceforth will be solved by this single approach. And you see that in things like purpose, for example. It's a very good and interesting idea. Actually, it's quite an old idea. In the 1980s, Winston Fletcher wrote a book called How to Capture the Advertising High Ground, which is pretty much an early book about how you effectively promote a higher order benefit rather than a lower order benefit. And by the way, there are brands and there are occasions for which that's a totally appropriate case. No one asked the question fundamentally, which is, yeah, but what happens when everybody does it, okay? When your sausage brand starts lecturing you on global warming, okay, or your crisp brand starts getting terribly het up about, some political issue, really actually what you've produced is you've produced advertising which is more and more same-ish and unnoticeable rather than advertising which actually cuts through. And so this is always the problem I remark on. In truth, okay, how you get ideas is kind of random and messy. And no one admits that because obviously if you're in the business of selling ideas, you have to pretend you have some magic source. But I would argue that any good process of trying to come up with an idea needs to acknowledge a period of messiness. That's why our Nudge Stock session tomorrow is dedicated to the idea of messy. It's like doing a cryptic crossword, it's like watching detective fiction. You have to accept that there's going to be a period where you don't really know what's going on, and you have to be comfortable with that. If you're desperate to move from a policy of from a point of ambiguity to a point of certitude, and you're too impatient to leave messiness behind, actually what you're doing is you're missing out on the process. If you look at scientific discoveries, by the way, most of them are not necessarily either the product of a sequential, rational, scientific process. In fact, only quite rarely, I think, do major breakthroughs emerge through intentional, sequential deployment of logical induction. Most of the time, they're a freak observation, or they're simple luck, or actually the beneficial product of unintended consequences. I was talking to someone from the American drug company Merck, and some years ago, they developed a program to try and develop effectively immunosuppressant drugs. Now, the reason you want drugs to suppress the immune system is there are certain conditions like rheumatoid arthritis where effectively your body's immune system is attacking yourself. Those conditions are deeply unpleasant, and it would therefore be very useful if you had immunosuppressant drugs which could actually achieve that end. And one of the chemical compounds they experimented with was very bad at this job. In fact, it was catastrophically bad because it seemed to actually boost the immune system rather than suppressing it. And so they kind of put it on a shelf and said, well, that was a bit of a failure, wasn't it? Until a few years later, someone very shrewd noticed that something that boosts the immune system may be absolutely hopeless in treating rheumatoid arthritis, but maybe it's promising in terms of cancer treatments. If you can actually boost the body's propensity to fight cancer cells, then that same thing that's a problem in one context is a positive, it's a feature, a positive benefit in another context. Famously, Night Nurse, for those of you who know the drug, that was developed as a daytime flu remedy. And it was very effective, except for the unfortunate consequence that it tended to send people to sleep. And so again, they abandoned the idea until someone, happily I'm proud to say in the marketing department, said, but if you position it as a nighttime cold and flu remedy, the fact that it sends you to sleep isn't a problem, it's a product benefit. If you look at the invention of Viagra, that was largely intended to be a heart drug. Someone happened to notice that when the trial was over, unusually, the people who'd been taking the drug on the trial, when asked, can you just return all the excess tablets you have, in 99 out of 99 previous occasions, everybody had said, yeah, fine, here they are. In this occasion, they said, no! Okay? And someone intelligently said, that's an outlier, that's never happened before. Not, let's ignore that because it's an outlier, it doesn't conform to our average. Instead, that's an outlier, so it's our job to investigate it. Penicillin, of course, the most famous serendipitous discovery. And I hate to make this point, actually, because I'm a bit of a fan of flexible working. But it is, in fact, true that on the day he discovered penicillin, by noticing that his petri dishes were basically bereft of bacteria anywhere where a particular kind of fungal spore had landed in the dish, on that day, Fleming was supposed to have been working from home. He had a place somewhere out in East Anglia, a country cottage. Much to his annoyance, there was some sort of crisis at the hospital, so he had to come in for the morning. And before heading home, he decided he'd pop and have a look in on the lab. So when those people who are, I don't like to say this, but when those people who are opponents of kind of, opponents of flexible working, fans of presenteeism, talk about serendipity, they do have a point. There's a certain amount of activity which you do not because you know why, but because you know that not doing it will prevent you from getting lucky. I always refer to this, what my friend Nassim Taleb would say is, there are certain things you do not for any particular reason you define in advance, but simply because doing them increases your surface area exposure to positive upside optionality. And I've had teenage children, and I realize their approach to parties is exactly the same. They don't have a party strategy. They don't, before they attend a party, write a list of objectives, okay? They don't know what the consequence of the party might be. It might be a complete waste of time. On the other hand, you might get invited to another party, or you might get invited on holiday, or you might learn an opportunity to get some work experience, or you might meet the love of your life, or whatever, or you might just have a great time. Okay? They don't know what the point of the party is in advance. They simply know that if you don't go to parties, nothing good will ever happen to you. It's highly unlikely that people will come round to your house and say, here's a wonderful opportunity for you, I just couldn't wait to let you know. So fundamentally, building a social network is like that. You don't know why you do it. You simply know that if you do it, you're more likely to have happy accidents happen to you than if you don't. And I think we got into a kind of problem in advertising because, and I should have warned you about this because I was in direct marketing for 20 years, which is we're only allowed to do the things we can completely measure and quantify and for which we can define the purpose in advance. I love direct marketing. I still consider myself a direct marketer. I love the fact that you could measure it. I love the fact that you could test. And I love the fact, above all, that you used to get these really freak surprises, that you get results which completely defied all logic. There was one mail pack we used to send out annually, and one year it did 3 times as well as in any previous year. Why? Well, we had various explanations. I hate to say it, but the real reason was there were rabbits, okay? There were pictures of rabbits, both on the envelope and on the inside letter. And the single best attested finding in advertising is actually, embarrassing though it sounds, that ads with animals in tend to do better than ads without animals in, okay? If there's one conclusion I think you can confidently draw to a high level of certainty, it's probably that. No one wants to say it, of course, because it makes you sound silly. But that was the reason. So I love direct marketing. The only problem with direct marketing, the great thing was you could measure and you could test. The only downside of that was you were never allowed to do anything you couldn't measure. And you were never allowed to do anything that didn't make sense in advance just to see what happened. occasionally that happened. You're allowed to do a test, and you got 1 or 2 variables in and said, let's just test these silly things. And surprisingly frequently, it was the silly things that produced the outlier results. But I think we've got into a position with advertising where you're not allowed to say the purpose of our advertising budget is just to expand our surface area exposure to positive upside optionality. You know, there are customers out there we can never identify ourselves, but who can identify themselves. You know, let's face it, programmatic marketing basically identifies customers. Longer-term brand marketing creates customers. You could argue highly targeted work, again, zones in on the customers you know you have. Less targeted work helps you discover the customers you didn't know you had. Okay? Because unless you are literally omniscient, there are always going to be 1 million people out there who will buy your product whom you never anticipated. I was talking to someone at Skoda, actually, who markets the Enyaq, the electric Skoda, and one of their total freak surprises was that a huge number of people are moving into an electric Skoda from Jaguar, BMW, Audi. Again, it's not something you ever would have prepared for in advance, because it sort of defies conventional thinking. In the event, however, that's how the world works. And this is my point about explore, exploit. How the world really works is how bees work. And a percentage of bees, as you know, bees have a waggle dance. They communicate to the other bees where and in which direction and how far you have to travel to find a reliable source of nectar or pollen or whatever the third thing is they collect. I think it might be resin or something. There are 3 particular ingredients that bees collect. And to the bafflement of bee scientists, they notice that it varies hugely, by the way, but let's say 20% of bees ignore the waggle dance. And they seem to just go off at random. And they thought, this is very strange, because it looks like an inefficiency. Why in 20 million years of bee evolution have we not evolved bee compliance officers who demand that everybody follows the waggle dance to the letter in order to meet our target for Q3, And the reason is, actually, they then modeled it as a complex system. And they realized that without the random bees, the hive gets, well, you can refer to it in various ways. One is over-optimized on the past. And that's one reason to be cautious about big data, by the way. All big data comes from the same place. It comes from the past. And therefore, the extent to which you can necessarily extrapolate from past data in order to justify doing something significantly new and different in the future is highly questionable. If you're over-optimized on data you have rather than on data you can imagine, you're trapped in this local maximum. You're trapped in this pool of attraction. And the first thing is, they then become incredibly vulnerable because if their existing sources of pollen, let's say there's a very good field, but some cows break in and eat all the flowers, they don't know where to go. And the second thing is, like the teenagers who stay at home and don't go to parties, they never get lucky. If you don't have the random bees, you never discover anything new. You never suddenly fly over the hill and go, shit, look at all the flowers down here, right? And now, what's interesting is I think most of us tend to look at those 2 processes of exploit and explore as if they're in opposition to each other. And indeed, if bees had personalities, I may be doing them injustice, maybe bees have fantastic personalities, but if bees had kind of human characteristics, I imagine the explore and the exploit bees would really hate each other. Because the explore bees would go, look at you people, you just follow orders, you're just grunts basically, you're just there doing your drudge work, doing what you're told, go out, get some nectar, come back, simple formula, energy expended in collection has to be less than energy collected, you're basically just a bunch of accountants. And the obedient bees would look at the random bees and go, what a bunch of fucking dilettantes, flying around at random, most of your journeys, you come back empty, mandibled, or whatever it is, okay? You come back with nothing. And they'd hate each other. Actually, provided, and this is a big if, provided the rogue bees, the random bees, share their discoveries with the rest of the hive by doing a waggle dance, This thing, the explore-exploit trade-off, by the way, is known in AI, it features in machine learning, it features in animal foraging. It's a kind of mathematical thing. It's the ratio of your resources which you deploy towards exploiting what you already know and exploring what it is you don't, or exploring what's changed, for example. So in other words, you wouldn't need to do much exploring if you had a completely constant environment. But since marketers don't operate in a completely constant environment any more than bees do, you have to ring-fence a certain amount of your resources for basically finding out what's changed. It may be trends have changed, it may be technology's changed, so that what you could reasonably ask people to do themselves online 5 years ago is different from what it'll be in 5 years' time. It may just be totally cyclical, by the way. I mean, one of the things that fascinates me in marketing is what I call the airport problem, which is that to some extent humans notice and appreciate what's different, okay? Now, when I was a kid, airports were shit, right? There was like a crappy cafe and a couple of vending machines and a two-day-old newspaper, and you sat there and you thought, God, this is shit, okay? And then eventually, some of the richer kids at my school had either been through like Changi, or more likely they'd been through Schiphol. And it's amazing, it's like incredible, like I bought a Walkman, you don't know what that is, do you? But I bought a Walkman for like, 150 quid, and it's brilliant, And my friend was at Frankfurt, and they said there's a sex shop in the airport. Wow, it's unbelievable, right? And everybody thought this is unbelievable. And then you had Dubai, and then you had Singapore. And then bit by bit, every airport basically becomes like the Rue de Faubourg Saint-Fucking-Honoré, right? It's just luxury goods shops stretching as far as the eye can see, and rather like Terminal 5, you can't buy an aspirin or any fucking suntan cream because it's been taken up by a branch of Hermes, right? And then, when it reaches that point, everybody goes, hey, have you been to London City Airport? It's brilliant, there are only 3 shops, you can get on the plane in 10 minutes, you see? And so, there are certain things where, to be honest, fashion is totally cyclical. Because you get boring airport problem, you solve that with big airports, then every airport gets big, and people go, oh, my favorite airport, Bergerac, there's just a field and a cafe, right? Ryanair, actually, funnily enough, EasyJet actually came to us, and they wanted to run an ad, a poster that said, fly to an airport, not an airfield, having a dig at Ryanair. And I remember saying, you do realize people love those airfields. It's the best bit of your holiday. There's actually a guy at Bergerac Airport, the local farmer, will look after your car for you and keep the engine turned over for like 20 euros a month. And there's a cafe where you know the bloke who serves you coffee, okay? So things change. And so you naturally have to devote and ring-fence a certain amount of your budget for explore, not exploit. And as I said, we tend to see these things in opposition. If bees had human personality, those two classes of bees would hate each other. Actually, when you think about it, it's a unity of opposites. It's entirely complementary. There's no point in exploring if you don't know how to exploit, but it's dangerous only exploiting if you're not doing any exploring. And the only way to look at this is through an Oriental mindset, effectively, where you don't look at everything as being a trade-off or a contradiction. You look at actually what you might call opposites which actually complement each other. And I think that's absolutely vital to marketing, because I think what we've done is we've got into a kind of Stockholm syndrome problem where we've been so used to being beaten up by accountants, we've started to become accountants ourselves. We've started to take on some of the attributes of our own worst abusers. Rather as apparently happens in strange hostage situations, And I think that's happening to us. We're going, oh, look how accountable we can be. And actually, some of the time, I think that's beneficial. As I said, I'm a direct marketer by temperament. Some of the time, we can just go, look, you can't measure or attribute everything that's worthwhile to do. If you confine yourself only doing the things you can justify in advance, that you can quantify in advance, and where you can actually attribute the value of a piece of activity on its own, in isolation from everything else you do, if you confine yourself to doing that, actually you're stuck at the bottom of the funnel. And you're under-exploring and you're over-exploiting, basically. And in the medium term, in the short term, you might do fine. In the long term, it's a really dangerous position. And what makes our working lives so difficult, I think, is everybody, basically, okay, we've evolved a working culture, we've evolved a political culture as well, where it's actually more important to win arguments than it is to solve problems. And we select people and we select people's ideas, okay, on the quality of argumentation, not on the quality of outcome. John Maynard Keynes spotted something similar where he said, worldly wisdom teaches it is often better to be precisely wrong rather than vaguely right. It's often better to fail conventionally than it is to succeed unconventionally. Better for the reputation. Generally, if you have a good argument for doing something, in the current work environment, you'll never get fired regardless of what happens as a consequence, because you've been rational. And the assumption we make is that degree of rationality that goes into making decision correlates exactly with quality of outcome of decision. Now, if that were true, okay, what we're doing at the moment in creating this argumentation culture wouldn't matter. I don't think it is true. Genuinely, I think in many cases the best thing to do may be counterintuitive, oblique, tangential, highly creative, strange. And so what we've done is we've effectively, everybody's trying to be Newton in a world where you need Darwin. Everybody's trying to turn everything into a physics problem with a single right answer, because that's how you win an argument, okay? When actually what we need is an approach which is optimized for problem solving and for outcomes, not for winning arguments. And the reason people always pretend complex systems are simple is because they know that if you pretend it's simple, you can come out with a single right answer, and therefore you've won the argument. Okay? If we're being honest about the environments in which we work as marketers, they're complex systems. There's no single right answer. There's no provably single right answer, and actually, more confusing still, the opposite of a good idea isn't necessarily wrong. It might be another good idea. And the worst thing I think that's come about because of this thing is basically the reason I call my book Alchemy is I think we have a total unwillingness either to look for magic or to believe it when it presents itself to us. Now, the reason for that is if you model everything on physics, there's no magic in physics. It's the laws of thermodynamics. Things cannot be created or destroyed. You're basically constrained to a finite system where everything's a trade-off. And this is my mate, Nicholas Gruen, described by Martin Wolf in the FT as the best economist you've never heard of. And he's an Australian economist based in Melbourne. I think he's an absolute genius. And he makes this great problem that he says, effectively, what's gone wrong with economics is this idea of the trade-off. The economics is the science of scarcity, and it is therefore paradigmatically about trade-offs. And so anybody who has a kind of physics or economics mindset will go into a problem saying there's going to be a trade-off between this and that. And the second you assume a trade-off, you don't look for magic, okay? Now, the really magical effects, as Roger L. Martin pointed out, has anybody read Roger L. Martin? Fantastic guy. Canadian business writer, the dean of the Rotman Business School in Toronto, the most marketing-friendly business guru we have, and utterly brilliant. And Roger L. Martin makes the point that in design thinking, when you're faced with a contradiction, you don't assume a trade-off. You ask, is there a creative way I can resolve this contradiction so it's no longer a contradiction? Okay? So an example of that would be, actually Southwest Airlines would be a perfect example. Southwest Airlines would normally say, do we want to have happy staff, happy passengers, or low prices? And everybody would assume, okay, it's a trade-off basically between where we are on the spectrum between kind of Emirates and Ryanair. Southwest Airlines, which is the most profitable and largest airline in the United States, actually set out with the objective to create all three. They didn't assume there was a trade-off. Famously, Toyota in car making, it was assumed there was a trade-off between product quality and the amount of money you spent on fault checking at the end of the production line. The second most reliable car in the world was eventually the Toyota Corolla, where they spent absolutely no money on fault checking at the end of the production line because the fault checking was built into the manufacturing process to begin with. Okay? Once you assume a trade-off, you're no longer looking for an idea. Okay? It's the biggest way in which you can use rationality to defend basically a lack of imagination. And so this is my great question, do you want to solve problems or do you want to win arguments? And I think we've created, I don't know if anybody listens to James O'Brien on LBC, but I always refer to what he does as kind of James O'Brien Jesuitical thought, which is he always wins the argument, but he starts the premise in a place of his own choosing, then effectively makes a whole load of sequential assumptions to arrive at a point which he then regards makes his own argument unassailable. But all you've got to do is either question the premise or question some of the assumptions, and actually, it's deeply unsafe. But what's so tragic about this is that when we arrive at a position through sequential reasoning, we are insanely overconfident in the strength of that positioning. And there's a great example here. I mentioned detective fiction earlier. This is from, I think it's from A Study in Scarlet, but it might be the sign of 4. In solving a problem of this sort, this is Sherlock Holmes speaking, although it's obviously Conan Doyle, who was, by the way, remember, a medical diagnostician. So he had learnt, his model of Sherlock Holmes was a guy called Dr. Bell in Edinburgh, who was a kind of brilliant deductive medic, who was absolutely brilliant at what Doyle subsequently called thinking backwards. So the grand thing is to be able to reason backwards. It's a very useful accomplishment and a very easy one, but people do not practice it much. In the everyday affairs of life, it's much more useful to reason forward, and so the other comes to be neglected. There are 50 who can reason synthetically, i.e. forwards, for every one who can reason analytically. And I think that's actually what's happened. I mean, there's a great quote from Kumal Galhotra, who's the head of Ford North America, where he says, car making is 100,000 rational decisions in search of one emotional decision. Okay? And so, in so many spheres of life, your best career move is to reason forwards. Not saying it's the best decision, I'm merely saying it's a really good career move, just to be able to demonstrate how good you are at reasoning forwards. And so as a result, the skill of reasoning backwards kind of atrophies. Okay? If you don't believe, by the way, the point about 100,000 rational decisions in search of one emotional decision, Volkswagen, I thought, were very unfairly hit by the emissions scandal in that they had to pay enormous fines in the United States, even though, if anybody's been to the United States, I don't know if you've noticed, there are very few Volkswagens, okay? The amount of actual harm it could have done to the US environment is minimal. Why are there so few Volkswagens? Very interestingly, German engineers, until very recently, refused to put cup holders in the car. Okay? Now, anybody knows American car buying knows that number of cup holders is pretty high up the decision tree. Certainly ahead of cornering or something like that. Okay? And so, by the way, you can't open drive-throughs for McDonald's and KFC in Germany very profitably because something like 60% of Germans won't allow food or drink in the car under any circumstances, okay? Your car's like a temple. And so the cup holder is an abomination. It's also worth remembering that car purists tend to drive manuals where cup holders aren't quite as good. Because you need one hand to change gear and it's difficult to do that while you're holding a Mr. Slushy 2-gallon bucket and whatever. But nonetheless, okay, I think this is fundamentally true. And there's a, bit of a formatting problem here. There's a big difference between reasoning forwards, where you basically go, this is true and therefore. We have data that tells us this. Ergo, from that data, by the way, they had great data here that you got 15% of registered people showing up, okay? And that was true last year, it was true before that, it was true in the 5 Mad Fest before that. This year, for whatever reason, and I have no idea why, like 70% of people turned up, okay? You can't always extrapolate from the past because things change. So you can either go, this is true, we know this, and therefore we can assume that. Okay? That's what I call James O'Brien Jesuitical thinking. Reasoning backwards involves unavoidably an active imagination, which is why people are uncomfortable doing it, because an active imagination is to some extent, by necessity, subjective. Okay? And what you want to do if you're interested in preserving your career is to avoid any show of subjective behavior, because that can get you fired, whereas objective rationality, never gets you fired. And so it's a fundamentally different question. What would have to be true if? And it involves, if you want to get into the pragmatic philosophers of the 19th century, and a man called Charles Sanders Peirce, who was kind of one of the most extraordinary American philosophers of the last 150 years, it involves what he calls abductive inference. In other words, you imagine possible scenarios. It's very similar to reasoning backwards. Look, there's this corpse on the floor, okay? What will happen next is reasoning forwards. Well, if we don't do anything, there's going to be an unpleasant smell in the room, okay? That's reasoning forwards. Reasoning backwards is what could the possible preconditions be that led to this state of affairs? And that does involve imagination. And so my point is, if you're not being creative, you're not being fully rational. If you don't allow room for the imagination, you're not actually being intelligent. You're merely being logical, okay? And yet no one ever makes this point that really robust, rigorous decision-making must involve a degree of mental experimentation. Notice this complete asymmetry that I rant about all the time, okay? And it's true, isn't it, right? Creative people must always present their ideas to rational people. Never happens the other way around, does it? Ever. Have you ever had someone from your finance department come into you and go, well, we think we've come up with the numbers for the quarterly forecast for next year, but before we present it up to WPP, we just wondered whether some wacky people had any better ideas, okay? Never fucking happens, right? It only happens one way around. And of course, when it's always the other way around, what have you got to do? You've got to win a fucking argument. Okay? And when you've got to win a fucking argument, what you've got to do is you've got to pretend that it's entirely sequential forwards thinking and that no backwards thinking has been involved at all. Most ads, okay? I'm absolutely not denigrating the value of great planning, great briefs, or great support stuff. Most ads basically happen backwards. Someone has a great idea, they go, shit, that works, I don't know how I got there, but let's post-rationalize this bad boy. Okay, that's basically how it works. No one wants to admit it, but nonetheless, it's fundamentally true, okay? And this is, I think, a very fair point, all the more interesting from having been made in 1910. You know, I'm not anti-science, don't get me wrong, okay? As part of the toolkit, science is absolutely essential. I'm certainly not anti-rational. When it comes to evaluating an idea, you want to be pretty left-brain about it. There are large jobs, like car design, okay, where you don't want people to be experimental. The next time I fly on a plane, the next time I drive in a car, I don't want to think the people who tighten the wheel nuts are like wildly wacky experimental people who are trying anti-clockwise this time for the lols, right? I don't want that, okay? So no, I'm not anti-science. I'm simply opposed to the monopoly that a particular kind of seemingly scientific methodology, which isn't actually like science at all, okay, has basically gained a stranglehold over all decision-making. And this is Woodrow Wilson, who bizarrely is my fourth cousin once removed or something. His mum was from England. But he's actually quite good at quotes, old Woodrow, so I'll keep him in. I'm going to skip this, but this is a point that there are different states of affairs. There are clear problems. This is Cynefin framework of Dave Snowden. I don't know if anybody's familiar with, he's a complexity thinker, former sort of scientist at IBM. You know, there are best practices in clear, simple problems. In complicated problems, there are simply good practices. There isn't necessarily just one. There can be many, okay? You don't necessarily want to benchmark or copy your competitor there because you're probably better off differentiating yourself. But there are good practices and there are bad practices. Then you get complex problems where cause and effect are not linear, patterns become visible only in retrospect. What you have to do there is basically rogue be it. You've got to experiment and see what happens because it's effectively not really comprehensible. You can't actually think your way through that problem simply because the interdependencies are too great. And then you have chaotic problems, which in the defense of all governments involved, I mean, the early days of the COVID outbreak were chaotic. You know, making extraordinary judgments about the decisions taken in various places and saying, oh, you were wrong, is highly dubious there because there wasn't yet a right answer. You didn't know enough, okay? And actually the only sensible thing you could do was probably to follow the precautionary principle and overreact. So this is my point. There's also a distinction between, okay, you know, in physics problems, you have all the data you need, okay? In complex problems, you don't, right? In physics, you remember high school physics. 2 buses leave a fucking bus station at noon. One travels due north at a speed of 100 kilometers an hour. One travels due west, actually it wouldn't be 100, would it be 80? One travels due west at a speed of 60 kilometers an hour. What time is it when they're 100 kilometers apart? Oh, it's 2 o'clock, right? Because that way, based on some fairly fucking stupid assumptions, like the buses travel in straight lines and always go at a constant speed, okay? That then gives you a single right answer, which is 2 p.m. In most of the problems we face as marketers, okay, a lot of the data we have is probably totally irrelevant, and therefore trying to come up with an answer based on what data you have, on the assumption that the more data you use, the better the decision you make, is probably pretty stupid, okay? That's fact number one. In most situations, and this is my mate Nassim Taleb talking, not me, okay? And he actually knows about this shit. Actually, in most actual specific situations, it's a handful of data points that really matter, okay? So trying to sort of build everything together into some massive, great, orgiastic kind of regression model probably isn't the way to go. But also, I mean, effectively, there's a huge opportunity for saying, what do we need to know to solve this problem that we don't know already, or looking for data which no one's thought of collecting, even though it already exists, because until this particular problem emerged, that data seemed weird and irrelevant, okay? I recently asked Coke, what I wanted to know from Coke, I won't go into any more detail, was what are the relative sales of fizzy drinks from Coke freestyle machines? Okay? Because I wanted to know what people drank when they weren't being observed, okay? Because there's a big difference in asking for a Coke and asking for a Dr. Pepper, right? But when you've actually got a machine and the choice architecture is different, it's rather like the fantastic finding, by the way, since McDonald's installed those screens which let you order, the number of people, particularly blokes, who order 2 burgers with a meal has gone up astronomically. No one's prepared to do that at a counter, because they're frightened the guy will go, what, you mean 2 burgers just for you? Second you put them behind a screen, they go, fill your boots, right? Okay? Now, I'll give you a few examples of this. This is a great book. When I was made creative director of something or other, Mike Walsh, who was then the head of Ogilvy Europe, gave me this book. And it's written like a hokey, oh, bucket, what's that? Okay, it's written like a hokey American business book of the 1920s. And I thought, well, Mark, that's a bit fucking insulting. Why have you bought me this infantile book? I was expecting like a subscription to Harvard Business Review or something, you know? And actually, after about a month, I got round to reading it, and I realized why Mike gave it. It's an absolutely brilliant book. It's a fantastic book. Whatever you do, read it. Oops, going a bit blinky. Is this the temperature, the heat? Can we get the picky back? Screen's gone. Are we rebooting? Because I now can't see what's on my slide. Here we go. Oh, here we are. There we are. Now, right. This. Thank you, guys. This was the John Lewis branch. Anybody here from Tunbridge Wells or part of the Kentish Mafia, or indeed Mafia of Kent? Respect. Absolutely. Okay. This was the branch of John Lewis in Tunbridge Wells, which closed down. And it basically went bust. And I'm sure there are a load of people collecting data at the moment in John Lewis who have decided that Tunbridge Wells is insufficiently prosperous or large a town to support a branch of John Lewis, okay? And that's the data they have, you know, size of town, demography of population, average income, blah-de-blah-de-blah. Does the store succeed? No. Let's draw a nice correlation relationship between size of town and success of John Lewis. Now, I took the obvious Adams approach. Oh, that's a bit weird. We got no picture chat. Oh, here we are. Sorry. Whoop, whoop. Oh, there we go. I took the obvious Adams approach to this, and I actually did something radical. I actually went and looked. Now, first of all, that is the entrance to the John Lewis is on the narrow side of the store. Okay? So it makes the store look vastly smaller than it really is. In reality, the place is actually about 3 times the size because it goes back for miles. Secondly, it has its own car park. So you can't park in the John Lewis car park and go anywhere except John Lewis. Okay? Thirdly, the entrance to the car park is completely appallingly signposted, so that by the time you've seen John Lewis car park, it's too late to turn into the car park. And for those who know the Knights, whatever it is, trading estate, you only get an opportunity to turn into the car park without crashing when you're leaving the retail park, not when you're arriving. Okay? Go back one. Oh, you're getting sick of John Lewis, are you? Back there? Okay? But finally, now this is what I'm saying. The number of people who are using data and metrics and kind of weird, whatever happens to be numerically expressible to solve a problem and to explain things, rather than using psychology, it's simply out of whack. Because I think they made an even bigger mistake, which is they called it John Lewis at home. Okay? Now, if you see the word home, think home base, home sense, etc., right? You think sells furniture. I'm not in the market for a sofa, so I won't bother going there, right? You know, we bought a sofa last year. I don't want to, I don't want to go in, or I don't want to go in with my partner because they might buy some item of furniture, or whatever it might be, okay? But I've spoken to loads of people locally who all assumed it was a furniture shop. I eventually went in after driving past it for 4 consecutive years and discovered they sold flat-screen TVs, computers, digital radios. In fact, they sold everything that a branch of John Lewis would sell, except, I think, women's clothing and cosmetics. Okay? So you could have called it John Lewis for blokes, because, I mean, we weren't bothered about that stuff, right? Okay? Or you could have just called it John Lewis, right? Why completely confuse the fuck out of people by adding 2 completely gratuitous words to the end of what is a pretty venerable retail brand, okay? Now, admittedly, okay, occasionally someone might come in and go, oh, I was looking to buy a dress and you haven't got any, okay? Well, in which case you just go, why don't you go to our website or whatever it may be, okay? But this is literally the kind of thing that's happening all the time. And yet the explanations, when people seek explanations, if they delve into what there happens to be data for, they'll be completely missing what really matters. I mean, probably, I'll skip this one, probably, can we go forward a couple? On the big screen, that is. Yeah, probably the best example of going and having a fucking look, okay, is the film The Big Short. How many of you have seen that? Okay? That's very interesting, because that is unbelievably, I think, unrepresentative. I mean, that's a majority of people in the audience, which I think suggests there's something about that film that really resonates with the people in the room, which is great to know. This is the absolute classic case of a couple of, a tiny number of weirdos who actually thought, rather than looking at a spreadsheet or looking at a mathematical model, why don't we go down to Florida and talk to some strippers, okay? I mean, by the way, and for the people who didn't see the film, I'm not recommending that as a general policy. They actually did that, okay? And find out what's actually going on. And when they finally went down and saw what was happening at where the wheels touched the tarmac, what they discovered was a total shit show, which was entirely invisible to the people at the top who are simply looking at aggregate data. And I think that's a really important point which makes marketers different from most people. Most data is collected for the purposes of aggregation, for the purposes of reporting upwards, because all the shareholders care about, all the top management care about is basically totals, okay? How much in total? Actually, and I'm quoting Mark Ritson here, the average is the enemy of the marketer, okay? Once you start averaging things, the information that marketers really need, which tends to be about outliers, is buried by the act of averaging. And so this is a quote actually quoted by Roger L. Martin, by a guy who's an expert in autism spectrum disorder, and he said, the answers to mysteries can often be found in the outlier data that does not seem to fit comfortably within one of the categories he or others have constructed. He drew a simple scatterplot diagram and then drew large circles around the dots that seemed to fit together. Finally, he pointed to a few dots farthest removed from the cluster of data. These are the really interesting things, he said. These are the guys that we study. Okay? And I think that's, that is actually true in a lot of science, that to suggest that by looking at averages of things, okay, you're being scientific, I think is a grotesque misrepresentation of what science is about, which is an honest spirit of inquiry. And also, your average customer probably doesn't exist. In fact, I mean, the irony is that if you managed to construct an average of all of your friends, you probably wouldn't like them very much. okay? It'll actually be really boring, okay? So this idea that you should sort of navigate around averages is fundamentally flawed. Secondly, there's top-down decision-making, which is people love averages. Why? Because if you're at the top of an organization, you haven't got a fucking clue what's going on. And therefore, if you're presented with averages, you enjoy the illusion of comprehension. You know, there's something there that you've got the time and attention to look at and measure and worry about, okay? Even though in many cases that information you're looking at, except when it comes to sort of annual shareholder reporting, is actually not where you should be looking at all. This is a bit more Roger L. Martin. I did ask his permission to tell this story. Ford, when it came to electrifying Ford, wanted to create a separate Ford electric division and to launch new brands of cars within the Ford electric division. So you'd have a new pickup truck brand, you'd have a new kind of crossover sports utility vehicle brand, you'd have a new subcompact brand, you'd have a new van brand. And Roger L. Martin, and it was a long, long argument, said, you're doing things so they look neat from the boardroom. Okay, we've got this thing with these brands, and we've got that thing with those brands, and it's all wonderfully neat because I've got a fucking organogram. Have you noticed that with management? They can't do shit without a fucking organogram, can they? I mean, I divide people. Everybody at Ogilvy is obsessed with like who reports to who. I just divide people into two categories of people who are good and people who are shit. Okay? But if you're an account man, no, that's not enough. You've got to know whether the shit person reports to a good person or whatever it is. I've never understood it. Anyway, that's done for the purpose of a nice, neat organogram. What Roger Martin said is, you're the Ford Motor Company of Dearborn, Michigan. You have 5 really strong things that resonate with the American public, and they are. You've got 3 of them there: Transit, Mustang, F-150, Bronco, and Explorer. Okay? Go and electrify those brands. And it took a huge battle, but he won the argument. And all you can say, now we don't know the counterfactual, but there is a waiting list for all of these vehicles, okay? Ford has a problem now with dealers actually marking up the price, which is a completely unfamiliar experience for Ford. But also look at some of the effects. You have, in the F-150, you have an electric vehicle designed for people who drive F-150 pickup trucks because it's branded the F-150 Lightning. And what that's achieved is it's got a demographic into electric vehicles who, without that brand, you would assume to be the most resistant to electrification imaginable, okay? Now, what they've done is they've built in various features, like the fact that, you know, if communists cut out your power supply, you can run your house off your truck. You know, there's a little bit there to appeal to the doomsday prepper and the survivalist. You know, you can run power tools off the back of the thing. But that is a case of kind of brand magic, because what you've actually done is you've started where your customers are, not where management likes things to be. And I think that's a brilliant example, to quote Sherlock Holmes, of thinking backwards. Think back from the shelf, don't think forwards from the factory. And nearly every bit of business thinking is basically thinks that value is created in the factory, and now all we've got to do is rationalize forwards. The correct way of looking at the world is that value is created in the showroom and on the shelf, and what you've got to do is work backwards. Now, I'll skip all this, I've already run out of time. This is just the problem of always wanting to look down from the top. An extraordinary book by an anarchist anthropologist called Seeing Like a State. This is Le Corbusier's plan for Paris. Okay? What Corbusier wanted to do is knock down Paris and replace it with something far more orderly. Has anybody been to that place, Brasilia, I think it is, where, following modern architecture principles, the whole belief in modern architecture was that things had to make sense from the air. Now, the problem with that is you create a completely separate residential district, office district, and retail district. So every time anybody has to do anything, they've got to travel from one district to another. It's unbelievably stupid unless you want the world to look neat to you rather than the world to be enjoyable as it's actually lived on the ground by real people. I've quoted this before. This is my real worry about the pretense of being scientific. I genuinely think there are more good ideas we can post-rationalize than are good ideas we can pre-rationalize. I think the number of ideas where we can say, logically, we ought to try this, okay? and where it works significantly well is a very small subset of the potential ideas out there where you go, we tried this, it worked surprisingly well, we set out to find out why. And that's fundamentally what I'm saying, is if you refuse to allow creativity into your decision-making process because you're trying to look scientific and rigorous, what you're actually doing is you're massively limiting the solution set. And you're massively, massively limiting the possibility of arriving at a solution that's really breakthrough, that's really, really significant. Because after all, the rational ideas have always been tried before. And then the other point is, the opposite of a good idea is another good idea. Don't think there's a best practice and anything that deviates from best practice is wrong. There are two great ways to check into a hotel. You can either make it really, really rich and human, or you can make it really, really frictionless and automated, where you just turn up with your phone and unlock your room. They're both great ways of checking into a hotel. They're complete opposites. The reason I have this image is that a few years ago, it was my classic moment where one of my aphorisms of the opposite of a good idea is another good idea was actually put to use. I was just about to go on stage. I was wearing beige trousers, and I went into the bathroom, and the wash basin disgorged its water from a pressurized tap onto my groin, okay? But what the hell do you do now? I tried the dryer, I tried everything. I was about to do a complete runner, okay? Because there was nothing I could do, and no one's going to pay attention to a word I say, okay? And then a miracle happened. It started to rain. And I went out onto the street and just stood in the rain for 5 minutes before I went on stage. Now, admittedly, everybody in the audience thought, why has that guy just fallen into a swimming pool? But it was better than the alternative, okay? The opposite of a good idea can be another good idea. Don't try and dry when you're wet, wet where you're dry, right? So anyway, I hope this is, oh, there we are. There we are. Once you think backwards, the opposite of a good idea can be another good idea. I'll skip these. No, I won't. Have I got 2 minutes or not? I have. 2 minutes? How many minutes? 2, okay. Just to give an example, someone was in charge of UNESCO partnerships, and they were given a massive delivery of Crocs. This is what I mean by think what the logical idea is and then ask if you can do better. And so the logical thing to do would be to find out areas of Africa where there's a particular shoe shortage and give the children Crocs there, okay? She thought about that and then came up with a better idea. What she did was she went to schools and said, when the children turn up to school on day 1, give them a pair of Crocs. They then came back from school with their first ever pair of shoes, and all their friends said, where did you get those shoes from? They give you them when you go to school. Next day, a lot more kids turned up at school. So you're now killing 2 birds with 1 stone. You're solving a problem in terms of shoelessness, but you're also using the shoes as an incentive to create a habit around attending education. That's what I mean about the rational idea and the better idea. This is one of my favorites. Restaurant in Saint-Emilion, France. 99.9% of people, if asked to put up a sign saying we don't want people to use mobile phones in the restaurant, would do that, right? It's a bit bossy, it pisses people off, okay? It's not very pleasant if you're going to a Michelin-style restaurant to have rules imposed on you, right? But it's all right. It does the job. No one's going to get fired for doing that. But they didn't do that. They chose a spot in the entrance to the restaurant which was visible to everybody coming into the restaurant, and they put up a notice which was ostensibly targeted at people leaving the restaurant. And it simply said this. Now, anybody coming into the restaurant goes, oh, I see there's a social norm around here that you turn your phone off. I better not look like a weirdo and a vulgarian by leaving my phone on. So it creates an implicit social norm, but it doesn't boss you around. That's what's so genius about that line, okay? It creates a norm, it changes behavior, but it changes behavior voluntarily. It creates a volunteer and not a conscript. Fundamentally, when you think backwards, marketing and innovation are fundamentally the same thing. Okay, there are 2 ways you can create value in the world. You can either work out what people want and find a clever way to make it, or you can work out what you can make and find a clever way to make people want it. And the value you create is indistinguishable regardless of your direction of travel. And I'll end on this story because it shows how great inventors are also great marketers. James Watt, inventor of the steam engine, wanted to sell steam engines. And the market for steam engines then, because they weren't yet used in transportation, was mine owners, because you could use a steam engine to drain mines. The trouble was, if you turned up to a mine owner and started talking about cylinder size and compression ratios and boiler temperatures, they very rapidly asked you to leave because they were totally uninterested. So Watt realized they needed a metrical unit for the steam engine that would appeal to mine owners. And he invented the horsepower. The horsepower was invented by James Watt because you simply went up to the mine owner and you said, this is a 25 horsepower steam engine. If you buy this steam engine, you can get rid of 25 horses. Okay, it's actually 75 because the horses had to work shifts, I think. It might have been 50. But he invented a metric which allowed him to sell his product. It's still in use today. Actually, the electric car industry hasn't yet quite done that, I would argue. They haven't had anybody with the genius of Watt to explain it's not enough to invent something, you've got to invent something in a way where its value becomes immediately apparent to the prospective buyer. And I'll end on one final story, which is this. This Elizabeth line cost about £20 billion, okay? Involved a huge amount of tunnelling, and it increases the capacity of London from east to west. That's top-down thinking. We have congestion in our lines going from east to west. We need to build a new tunnel, okay? This is bottom-up thinking. It's the overground, okay? It costs something like 3% of the cost of Crossrail. Why? Because most of the lines already existed, okay? What they did is they tarted up the trains, they made the frequency of the trains a bit better, they made the stations a bit better. But I travelled on this back in the 1990s from Stratford to Richmond, where we had a client. It was, seriously, there was tumbleweed on the trains. I was the only passenger on the train. It was called Silverlink Metro for the train fans among you, okay? What did they do, okay? This carries as many people every day as Crossrail does. But it cost about 3% as much. Why? Because they didn't build the value with tunnelling, they built the value with ink. All they did is rebrand it, call it the overground, give it a unity identity, and then they added it to the tube map. And for the first time in 50 years, people could look at those railway lines and go, fuck me, I never knew you could go from there to there. I had a daughter of a colleague of mine say to her dad recently, Dad, I want to live in Peckham because it's really handy for Shoreditch. And of course, he burst out laughing, because if you'd said that in 1988, you would have been sectioned, okay? But suddenly, this has caused people to completely rethink their own internal map of London. It's created value through ink and psychology, not through tunnelling. That's what happens when you think bottom up rather than top down. I'll skip that because I haven't got time and these people are desperate. But basically, this is all you need to know, okay? In economics, there's no such thing as a free lunch. There are always trade-offs. If you enjoy something in one place, someone is always paying for it somewhere else. When you think backwards, when you start with psychology and perception and behavior, which are complex systems, rather than starting with economics, which is a crude, simple system, okay, there are free lunches like here, all over the place. Here are our books from me and my colleagues, and all it remains for me to say is thank you very much indeed. Oh. A pleasure.